February 13th, 1943, 7:15 hours, Guadalcanal. Rain streaked across the runway as the first Corsairs taxied into war. Mechanics whispered doubts, Japanese scouts smirked from afar, and the Pacific skies prepared to test a machine many had already written off as a clumsy gull wing. In 1940, inside Vaught's Connecticut factory, draftsmen stared at a design that looked less like a fighter and more like a seabird caught in mid-flight. The design began not with elegance, but with necessity. Rex Beisel, Vaught's chief engineer, knew the Navy demanded what no fighter had yet achieved: blistering speed, heavy armament, and the endurance to carry America's war hopes across the Pacific. His answer was audacious: marry the most powerful radial engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, to the slimmest fuselage that could contain it. 2,000 horsepower promised speeds above 400 miles per hour, a figure that dwarfed everything in the Navy's inventory. But there was a catch. The giant engine required a propeller more than 13 feet in diameter, too long for conventional landing gear to clear. Beisel's solution looked like a mistake of nature: wings bent downward before sweeping up again in a gull's arc. The inverted gull wing was not stylistic bravado, it was geometry, allowing shorter, sturdier gear legs while still clearing that immense propeller. From drafting tables to the factory floor, workers muttered at the silhouette. To some it looked more like a bird awkwardly folding its wings than a precision fighter. No one doubted the power on paper, but many doubted whether it could ever fly safely, let alone land. On May 29, 1940, test pilot Boone Guyton climbed into the prototype XF4U at Bridgeport, Connecticut. He thundered down the runway, lifted cleanly into the air, and instantly justified Beisel's gamble. The prototype became the first U.S. Navy fighter to break 400 miles per hour, clocked at 404 in trials. On paper, it was a revolution. Paper, however, concealed realities. Each aircraft cost over $50,000, 0 cents steep for the era, and when the bird came back to Earth, its promise faltered. The long nose blocked forward view. The massive propeller pulled hard, making landings unpredictable. Crosswinds caught the bent wings, slamming the fighter onto the deck with brutal force. Navy evaluators scribbled into reports, "The Corsair lands like a drunk duck." Test pilots themselves coined grim nicknames: U-Bird, Ensign Eliminator. The implication was clear. The aircraft was as likely to kill its own inexperienced pilots as the enemy. Landing accidents multiplied. A February 1941 Bureau of Aeronautics report noted serious stall and visibility problems that demanded correction. Guyton himself, after wrestling with the prototype, wrote into his test log a line that became legend: "She will either be the Navy's salvation or its coffin." Doubts rippled up the chain of command. Ed Demont, John Towers, Chief of Naval Aviation, leaned toward Grumman's safer bets. The F-4F Wildcat was slower, barely reaching 318 EMFs, but it could be landed on a carrier without disaster. Here lay the contrast. The Wildcat was survivable but obsolete. The Corsair revolutionary but lethal to its own. Despite misgivings, the raw statistics dazzled. In 1941, the Navy placed production orders for 584 Corsairs. The specifications promised more than any contemporary rival. Propeller diameter 13 feet 4 inches. First flight, May 29, 1940. Top speed, 404 mph. Unit cost, early runs, 0 cents. Initial contracts, 584 aircraft. Compared to the Wildcat, the gap was stark. The Grumman fighter carried 4 duty 50 caliber guns. The Corsair would carry 6. The Wildcat's range rarely stretched beyond 770 miles. With drop tanks, the Corsair projected over 1,000. The math screamed promise. The landings whispered danger. Where the Navy hesitated, the Marine Corps saw opportunity. Marines operated from rough island strips, not carriers. For them, the Corsair's unforgiving landings mattered less than its speed, firepower, and endurance. They pressed hard for deliveries. Here is where myth must be tempered. Later retellings painted the Corsair as universally despised, rejected until late in the war. Reality was more nuanced. From the start, Marine aviators argued the aircraft's flaws were survivable, and its advantages indispensable against the Japanese Zero. The irony was stark. A fighter mocked for its bent wings, cursed for its crashes, and nearly rejected by the Navy already carried the seeds of superiority. The very geometry that inspired ridicule, the inverted gull, was the key to unlocking horsepower no other fighter of 1940 could harness. Rex Beisel's gamble was ungainly but powerful. Boyington's warning, salvation or coffin, hovered over every sortie, and as America braced for a war it had not yet entered, the Corsair waited in the shadows of hangars. Dangerous, awkward, but undeniably fast. The Pacific would soon answer the question, would this bent-wing bird break its own pilots or break the enemy? Guadalcanal's jungle canopy trembled under the roar of new engines. Pilots braced to prove the bird's worth. The Solomons were not a proving ground anyone would have chosen. The runways were rough, carved from jungle mud and coral. Heat shimmered over the strip, the air thick with oil, sweat, and nerves. This was Henderson Field, already a graveyard of aircraft and men. Into this crucible, in February 1943, came VMF 124. 12 Corsairs stood on the sodden ground, their bent wings casting strange shadows in the morning haze. Mechanics slapped mud from tires and muttered curses about the fighters' quirks. But there was no turning back. Major William Gies, the squadron's commander, gathered his pilots beneath dripping palms. Their orders were brutally simple. Take the new Corsair into combat against the Mitsubishi A6M0, the most feared fighter in the Pacific. On February 13, 1943, the Corsair's baptism began. 12 aircraft clawed into the humid sky, their R-2800 engines thundering like artillery through the jungle canopy. They climbed toward enemy territory, leveling between 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Among them was Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, sharp-eyed and unshakable. That day he logged the Corsair's first aerial victories over the Japanese. His diary would later note the contrast. The Zero could turn, but the Corsair could dive away like a thunderbolt. Kenneth Walsh, 1943 diary. The Corsair had proven its potential, but the cost was steep. In those first weeks, triumphs came hand in hand with tragedies. VMF 124 lost men not only to Japanese guns but to accidents, mechanical failures, and Henderson's punishing terrain. The airstrip chewed up landing gear, engines overheated in the tropical heat. Pilots misjudged the Corsair's long nose and vanished into the trees. The squadron's February-March 1943 action reports read like ledgers of survival. Victories scored, aircraft destroyed, and young aviators who never returned. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later recalled his first encounters. "We laughed at its awkward wings until we saw its speed." Saburo Sakai, post-war interview. The laughter did not last long. The statistics from those opening months tell a story of promise mixed with peril. First mission, February 13, 1943, with 12 Corsairs launched. Walsh's eventual tally, 21 confirmed kills by war's end, earning the Medal of Honor. Typical combat altitudes, 8,000 to 12,000 feet, where Corsairs could exploit their speed. Early exchange rate, roughly 1 Corsair lost for every 1.2 Zeros destroyed, better than Wildcats, but still costly. In strategic range, Henderson to Kahili, a key Japanese base, 560 miles, a punishing stretch for pilot and machine. For the Marines, survival wasn't measured in abstract ratios, but in the count of who walked back at dusk. The contrast between the Corsair and the Zero defined every engagement. Zero's turning radius, barely 330 feet, pivoting almost inside its own wingspan. Corsair's dive speed, above 500 MAFs, far beyond anything the Zero could match. The lesson hardened quickly. Never try to turn with a Zero. Instead, climb high, dive hard, strike once, and pull away. Pilots who forgot the rule rarely came home. Kenneth Walsh embodied this brutal learning curve. Calm, methodical, and fearless, he mastered the Corsair's strengths while respecting its flaws. By the end of 1943, he was recognized as one of the Corps' first great Corsair aces. Of diving attacks, he later wrote, "It was like riding a thunderbolt. The faster I went, the safer I felt. The Zero could not follow." The Navy had already turned the Corsair aside, favoring the steadier Hellcat for carriers. But the Marines had no such luxury. Operating from improvised jungle airstrips, they accepted the Corsair as it was, flaws and all. Its speed and firepower outweighed its vicious landing habits. Thus was born the Corsair's early reputation as a marine fighter. The Hellcat would guard the decks, the Corsair would fight from the islands. Each had its domain. The irony was impossible to miss. Japanese aces who had once scoffed at the bent wing silhouette now warned of its menace. The ungainly form masked a predator's heart. The price for the Marines was high. Aircraft wrecked, comrades buried in coral soil, victory paid for in blood. Yet every mission shifted the balance. Every Zero downed, chipped away at Japan's aura of supremacy. The Corsair's baptism was no clean triumph. It was dirty, uneven, and written in the mud of the Solomons. But from those battered strips, the clumsy gull wing began its transformation into legend. On flight decks from Norfolk to Pearl, the Corsair slammed, bounced, and broke men's bones. The promise of speed meant nothing if the bird could not land safely on a moving deck. The Navy learned that lesson the hard way. In 1942, the Corsair went to sea for carrier trials. On paper, it looked unbeatable. 417 miles per hour, 6.50 caliber Brownings, and enough range to escort bombers deep into enemy skies. But on flight decks, numbers gave way to physics. The long nose blinded pilots on approach. The broad wings caught crosswinds. The giant propeller torqued the aircraft into sudden rolls. Time after time, Corsairs hit the deck, bounced high, and smashed into barriers. Some careened into the island's superstructure. Accident reports estimated one crash for every 7 landings. The USS Sangamon's June 1942 trial report was blunt. Broken landing gear, wrecked planes, injured pilots. By 1943, the patience of the Bureau of Aeronautics was gone. Admiral Towers, Chief of Naval Aviation, issued the order, "Keep them off my decks." Carrier operations demanded predictability, and the Corsair could not deliver it. Instead, the Navy pinned its hopes on Grumman's new F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was slower, 376 MPs against the Corsair's 417, but it was forgiving. Pilots could plant it on the deck without shattering themselves or the ship. By mid-1943, production figures told the verdict: 3,578 Hellcats built that year versus just 948 Corsairs. The fleet would rely on Grumman's workhorse, not Vaught's thoroughbred. Rejection at sea did not mean rejection in war. The Marine Corps had no intention of abandoning the Corsair. Gen. Alexander Vandegrift, veteran of Guadalcanal, argued the point. Marines didn't need a gentle carrier fighter. They needed speed, range, and firepower. They needed a machine that could claw Japanese Zeros from the sky and strafe jungle ridges into silence. For them, the Corsair fit perfectly. Its flaws on carriers mattered less on rough coral strips hacked out of the jungle. Some commanders embraced it outright. John Blackburn of VF-17, the Jolly Rogers, made the Corsair his squadron's emblem. His men painted skull and crossbones on the cowlings and learned to fight the bird on its own terms. In combat, the gamble paid off. Faster, heavier, and longer ranged than the Zero, the Corsair became the Marines' chosen weapon. Blackburn later reflected, "On the islands, we made her ours." Landing accident rate, ~1 per 7 attempts in early carrier trials. Top speed, Hellcat 376 mph vs Corsair 417 points. Armament, both carried 6 caliber Brownings. Production 1943, Hellcats 3,578 vs Corsairs 948. Carrier approval, not until April 1944, after Marines had already proven it ashore. The statistics reinforced the divide. For the Navy, safety and numbers ruled. For the Marines, survival demanded the fastest gunfighter available. The irony was sharpened abroad. The British Fleet Air Arm, receiving Corsairs through Lend-Lease, clipped wingtips for carrier hangars and refined landing techniques. By late 1943, British squadrons were already operating Corsairs from carriers successfully. This undercuts a common myth. The Corsair wasn't universally rejected until 1944. It was the U.S. Navy that delayed, while the British proved the fighter could be tamed at sea. Thus, the Corsair stood divided. Too dangerous for American decks, yet indispensable on Pacific islands. The Navy leaned on the Hellcat, a steady shield. The Marines embraced the Corsair, a sharp sword. The irony was cruel. The bird that shattered American pilots on carrier decks would go on to shatter Japanese dominance in the Solomons. While admirals turned away, Marines and Jolly Rogers carved the Corsair's reputation into the skies, not from polished decks, but from mud, heat, and fire. Over Bougainville, bent wings folded into combat arcs that would decide Pacific supremacy. The Solomons campaign shifted north in late 1943. From Bougainville's muddy strips, Marine and Navy flyers hurled their Corsairs into skies already crowded with veteran Zero squadrons. Here, the duel that would define the Pacific reached its peak. The Corsair was fast, heavy, and brutal. The Zero remained nimble, light, and deceptively lethal. Their collisions would determine whether Rex Beisel's gamble had produced a miracle or a mistake. Every Corsair pilot learned the same law: never fight a Zero in a turning contest. The Japanese fighter's agility was unmatched. With a turning radius of barely 330 feet, it could pivot inside the Corsair's circle and fire before the American pilot could line up a shot. But the Corsair had its own trump card. In a dive, it was untouchable. Clocked at more than 550 miles per hour, it screamed earthward faster than any Japanese machine could follow. From this, doctrine emerged: climb high, dive fast, strike once, and pull away. The method became known as boom and zoom. Done right, it kept the Zero perpetually behind the curve, lunging upward into the guns of a heavier, faster Predator. The Zero, graceful at low speeds, had no answer in vertical combat. In September 1943, a new squadron took the field. VMF 214, the Black Sheep. Their leader was Major Greg Pappy, Boyington, flamboyant, scarred, unpredictable, but deadly effective. He gathered a ragtag mix of pilots, some veterans, many barely trained. What they shared was nerve and a commander who demanded aggression. To his credit, this was done without comment. For 12 blistering weeks, from September to December 1943, the Black Sheep tore through Zero formations over Bougainville. They logged 94 aerial victories in that span, stunning both sides. Boyington himself would end the war with 28 confirmed kills, 22 of them in Corsairs, making him one of the Corps' most decorated aces. He summarized his squadron's defiance bluntly: "They called us clowns, then we burned their circus." The VMF 2014 diary from October 1943 captured the chaos. Pilots described slashing into zero formations, firing at ranges often under 400 yards. Aircraft returned with oil-smeared canopies, wings riddled with holes, and fuel gauges scraping empty. One entry detailed Boyington's favored tactic: climb above, roll inverted, and dive nearly vertical. The Corsair howled as it picked up speed, guns flashing. When it pulled out, the Zeros below were too slow to respond, their elegant turns wasted against raw velocity. Japanese pilots quickly recognized the threat. Masajiro Mike Kawato, an Imperial Navy ace, later admitted the Corsair was invincible in a dive. What had been mocked as awkward was now dreaded. Pilots who once sneered at the bent wings began warning, "Avoid them if possible." The Corsair could not outturn a Zero, but it no longer had to. The balance tilted on a stack of small advantages. Dive speed, 550 plus Ms, unrivaled in the Pacific. Climb rate, 3,250 flash min Vs, the Zero's tilde, 3,100. Gun range, 6 Brownings, shredding fragile Zero airframes at less than 400 yards. Boyington's tally, 28 kills, 22 in Corsairs. Late 1943 casualty ratios, reports suggested as high as 11 enemy aircraft lost per Corsair, a staggering reversal from 1942. The data was imperfect, claims often exceeded confirmed losses, but the trend was undeniable. The Corsair was mastering the Zero. Cold Merritt Edson, Marine Aviation Commander, saw the shift firsthand. He had watched his squadrons bleed in 1942. By late 1943, with Corsairs in the line, his reports spoke of something new: confidence. Morale mattered. The Corsair didn't just outperform, it restored belief that the Japanese could be beaten in the air. With each dogfight, the Corsair's reputation inverted. Once considered too dangerous for its own pilots, it was now feared by the enemy. Once rejected from carriers, it became the pride of marine strips. Japanese flyers who had laughed at the bent silhouette now whispered warnings about its dives. The Zero still killed unwary Corsair pilots in turning fights, but the strategic balance had shifted. For the first time, Japanese command cautioned, "Do not engage Corsairs without advantage." By December 1943, the skies over Bougainville belonged to the bent-wing bird. Black Sheep Corsairs streaked out of the sun, tearing into Zero formations. Pilots described firing at targets that seemed frozen in their gun sights, while the world blurred around them. For Japanese veterans like Kawato, it was a nightmare, watching comrades disintegrate under a storm of fire they could not outfly. Across the Solomons, the kill counts told the same story. The Corsair was tipping the scales. By year's end, the Corsair was no longer a liability, it was a predator. Combat ratios, morale reports, and enemy reactions all said the same thing: the balance of air power had shifted. The irony was complete. The fighter, once dismissed as unfit for combat, now forced Japan to retreat not only in the air, but in thought. The bent-wing bird no longer looked clumsy. It looked inevitable. Mockery had given way to dread, and with it came the first true cracks in Japan's aerial supremacy. In Michigan's frozen winter, factory lights burned, as women riveters bent steel into bent wings. The Corsair was not just forged in battle, it was hammered into existence by thousands of unseen hands. Engineers, riveters, foremen, and ferry pilots, who never saw combat but built the machine that would dominate it. By 1943, demand had outstripped Vaught's capacity. The Navy turned to other manufacturers to spread the load. Goodyear Aircraft in Akron, Ohio, and Brewster Aeronautical in Pennsylvania joined the effort. Together, they formed a nationwide enterprise, stamping parts, welding frames, and testing engines in freezing hangars that never went dark. The Corsair was no longer just a fighter. It was an industrial project as sprawling as the war itself. Goodyear's plant, once devoted to tires for peacetime highways, now reccoed with rivet guns and welding torches. By January 1944, its FG-1 Corsairs were rolling out by the dozen each week. Workers joked Akron smelled more like oil than rubber. Brewster, smaller and less efficient, produced only 735 aircraft, but every one added to the front line's supply. In total, the three companies would deliver 12,586 Corsairs. At peak, American factories turned out 24 Corsairs a day. Unit cost plummeted from $51,000 to roughly $23,000 by 1945. In sheer scale, it didn't rival Ford's Willow Run, where B-24 Liberators rolled out by the thousands, but the contrast was sharp. Willow Run built bombers for grand strategy. Corsair factories built the knife-edge weapon that secured the Pacific sky. The image of Rosie the Riveter was no propaganda cliché here. In Akron, Detroit, and Stratford, women filled factory floors, tightening bolts and bending aluminum. Most had never touched heavy machinery before the war. Now, they built fighters that Marines would carry into history. One Goodyear foreman remembered watching women lift the awkward gull wings into place. His summary captured both the challenge and the triumph. The wing bent, but it never broke. Goodyear plant foreman, 1944. Even Charles Lindbergh, once America's most famous aviator and later a controversial isolationist, slipped into the Corsair's story. In 1944, he flew Corsair missions in the Pacific as a civilian consultant. He pushed the bird beyond limits, testing its ability to carry bomb loads normally reserved for medium bombers. After one sortie, he declared, "It can carry more bombs than a B-17. Charles Lindbergh, 1944 report. It was exaggeration. No Corsair matched a flying fortress. But the point stood. The fighter, once dismissed as too clumsy for carriers, was now dropping payloads that blurred the line between fighter and bomber. Total built, 12,586 Corsairs. Goodyear output, 4,006. Brewster output, 735. Unit cost, $23,000 by 1945, down from $51,000. Peak output, 24 per day. These figures told a story not only of combat, but of industrial will. Without these factories, Boyington's Black Sheep and Walsh's Medal of Honor missions would never have taken flight. By 1944, the Corsair had outgrown its birth as a pure dogfighter. Strapped with bombs and rockets, it dived on bunkers, bridges, and convoys with devastating effect. This adaptability set it apart from its Japanese rival. The Zero remained a nimble duelist, but could not evolve into a strike aircraft. The Corsair became a hybrid. Interceptor, bomber, and escort all in one frame. That flexibility gave Marines a weapon not just for dogfights, but for breaking the ground war wide open. The Corsair's reputation grew with its kill tallies. Reports often claimed 11 one-kill ratios. 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost. The truth was less uniform. Some squadrons, especially late in the war, did achieve extraordinary margins as Japanese training collapsed. Others endured heavier losses. Records confirmed the Corsair's effectiveness, but the legend sometimes outran the data. Reality was enough. The Corsair was deadly, but its pilots paid for that edge in blood and attrition. The Corsair's production story mirrored its combat arc. Born in doubt, mocked for its bent wings, cursed for its crashes, it was soon rolling out by the thousands, its cost dropping as its reputation rose. Factories that once made tires or appliances now produced the machine that erased Japanese air dominance. Women who had never seen an ocean-built aircraft that darkened skies from Rabaul to Okinawa. And even Lindbergh, the same man who once counseled against American war, climbed into a Corsair and declared it the best fighter-bomber in the Pacific. The bent-wing bird had become more than a machine. It was the industrial symbol of American adaptation and stubborn resolve. The decks of USS Essex thundered in late 1944 as Corsairs finally claimed the sea. The Corsair had been banished from the carriers once. Now it returned with vengeance. By late 1944, after 2 years of island warfare, engineers and pilots had solved the bird's most dangerous quirks. Small changes made a massive difference. Cockpit seats raised for visibility over the long nose, tail wheels lengthened to soften approach angles, oleo struts redesigned to dampen the bone-shattering bounce. Pilots drilled relentlessly in curved approaches until muscle memory conquered fear. The fighter that once skidded and cartwheeled now caught the wires with precision. The bent-wing bird had found its nest. The Navy moved cautiously. Memories of broken gear and smashed decks lingered, but in November 1944, Bf-84 aboard USS Bunker Hill proved the case. The squadron's action report that month recorded not disaster, but redemption. Accident rates plummeting, landings clean, combat sorties executed without hesitation. One pilot, after snagging a wire on a flawless approach, said what many felt: "Now the bird has found its nest." Once aboard carriers, the Corsair carried the war to Japan's doorstep. At Iwo Jima, bent wings roared low over volcanic ash, blasting pillboxes and strafing defenders. At Okinawa, the fighter earned its deadliest reputation: kamikaze killer. Corsair squadrons intercepted wave after wave of suicide aircraft. No fighter could stop them all, but records credit Corsairs with destroying nearly 60% before they reached the fleet. For sailors below, the scream of whistling death overhead meant survival. The bird's strike role expanded too. With reinforced wings and racks, it carried bomb loads of up to 4,000 pounds. Ordnance once reserved for medium bombers, a machine mocked for bouncing off decks was now doubling as a dive bomber, hammering Japanese convoys and coastal strongholds. The Bunker Hill action log from November 1944 captured the moment. Corsair carrier operations conducted with marked improvement. Landing accidents reduced by 70% compared to early trials. The verdict was clear. The Corsair, once written off as unsafe, was now listed as a reliable carrier fighter bomber. From that month on, it was no longer just the Marines' bruiser. It was part of the fleet. The Corsair's redemption carried new heroes. Ira Kepford, VF-17 ace, his canopy ringed with swastika and Hinomaru kill marks, became a living icon of Marine air power. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, singled out the Corsair in his reports, praising its unmatched versatility in air defense and ground strike. L.T. Thomas Hudner, though his Medal of Honor story belonged to Korea in 1950, represented the new generation of carrier-trained Corsair pilots. Proof the bird's reach would outlast the war itself. Bomb load, up to 4,000 pounds. Bf-84 at Okinawa, 92 kills logged. Kamikaze interception rate, tilde, 60%, credited to Corsair squadron. Combat radius, 1,015 miles with drop tanks. Carrier accident rate, cut by 70% with training and modifications. The numbers no longer whispered doubt, they shouted dominance. Admin Spruance, veteran of Midway and the Marianas, summarized what his flyers already knew. The Corsair is the best prop fighter of the Pacific War. Spruance's judgment was never given lightly. For him to single it out marked the moment of full vindication. Even in triumph, roles diverged. The Hellcat remained the steady shield, easy to fly, forgiving to land, mass-produced in staggering numbers. The Corsair was the sharp sword sent on the hardest jobs, high-risk interceptions, deep strikes, and kamikaze defense. By 1945, the Pacific War effort rested on both pillars, but the bent-wing fighter had earned its place as the fleet's deadliest blade. The irony was absolute. Once banned from carriers, the Corsair now launched from the Navy's most modern flat-tops, carrying bomb loads heavier than some bombers, intercepting suicide planes, and dominating skies once ruled by the Zero. From the coral strips of Guadalcanal to the armored decks of Essex-class carriers, the Ensign Eliminator had transformed into the indispensable hammer of the Pacific. What began as an outcast ended as the Navy's cutting edge. In Tokyo war rooms, officers circled the Corsair's bent silhouette in red pencil, no longer a curiosity, but a warning. By 1945, the silhouette was unmistakable. Long nose, bent wings, the strange profile once mocked as ungainly. Now, Japanese briefings marked it as the harbinger of defeat. The Corsair was no longer a rumor on Pacific airstrips. It was the shape of inevitability. Frontline reports reflected the change. Where once pilots had laughed, they now spoke of dread. Some nicknamed it the Blue Death. Masajiro Kawato, an ace who survived multiple encounters, admitted, "Every time we saw that wing shape, fear struck before bullets." The Corsair no longer had to prove itself. Its reputation flew ahead of it. As air superiority collapsed, Japan turned to desperation, the kamikaze. By late 1944 and into 1945, thousands of barely trained pilots were sent on one-way missions. At Okinawa they came in waves, black specks on the horizon swelling into screaming dives. The Corsair met them head-on. From April to June 1945, Corsair squadrons flew 6,421 sorties, intercepting nearly 1,900 kamikazes. Many ships were still struck, dozens sunk, thousands killed. But without Corsair interceptions, the carnage would have been far worse. For many sailors, survival that spring came whistling down from bent wings above. Japan's last elite unit, the IJN 343rd Kokutai, entered combat in 1945 under strategist Minoru Genda. Their combat log reads like a requiem: dwindling aircraft, green recruits rushed into battle, fuel shortages even before takeoff. Against Corsairs and Hellcats, their aces were thrown into hopeless odds. Entries described veterans falling within minutes, rookies vaporized before firing a shot. What had once been duels now felt like executions. The deeper truth lay in training. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators logged 500-plus hours before combat. By 1945, shortages cut that to under 150 hours. American pilots, by contrast, averaged 400-plus hours before seeing action. The result was inevitable. Surviving Japanese aces like Kawato or Saburo Sakai could still fight, but they were increasingly alone. Entire squadrons of green recruits faced hardened Marines in Corsairs and were annihilated. By war's end, Corsair pilots claimed till 2,140 enemy aircraft destroyed. At Okinawa, VF-84 alone claimed 92 kills. The bent-wing fighter became the hammer of the Pacific, fast enough to chase raiders, rugged enough to absorb fire, versatile enough to strafe bunkers or dive on kamikazes. Marine ace Kenneth Walsh, reflecting in a 1945 debrief, put it plainly, "The Corsair owned the sky." The industrial duel was already lost. Japan's peak production, 28,000 planes in 1944, collapsed to barely 8,000 in 1945, most obsolete before they reached the front. American factories still rolled out Corsairs by the hundreds, their costs cut nearly in half. Japan's fighters arrived too late, too few, too fragile. Kenneth Walsh, "The Corsair owned the sky." Masajiro Kawato, "Every time we saw that wing shape, fear struck before bullets." These two voices, survivor and opponent, captured the shift. The Corsair was no longer just an aircraft. It was psychology, dread made visible in bent wings. The comparison was cruel. 1941, Zeros ruled the Pacific, flown by elite aviators. Americans fought with slower, weaker machines. 1945, Corsairs, Hellcats, and Mustangs swept the skies. Zeros were flown by boys with barely 100 hours of training. The pendulum had swung so far that Japan's former symbol of invincibility had become a relic of desperation. For Japan, the cost was more than machines. It was a generation of aviators. Each kamikaze sortie stripped away skill that could never be replaced. For Americans, the Corsair reduced casualties but never erased them. Pilots still failed to return, still vanished into sea and jungle. Yet by 1945 the imbalance was overwhelming. The irony was sharp. The Corsair, once mocked as clumsy, rejected from carriers, cursed for broken landings, had become the instrument of fear in Japanese war rooms. Its bent wings, once a punchline, were now the outline of defeat. Every time they appeared over Okinawa or the home islands, they carried not only bombs and bullets, but inevitability itself. For Japan, the war in the air was already over. Decades later, museum hangars echo with the ghostly whistle of bent wings. The Corsair's story did not end with surrender in Tokyo Bay. For a machine born in mockery, its afterlife was extraordinary. While most piston fighters faded in the jet age, the bent-wing bird endured. Production continued until 1953, making it the longest-lived piston fighter line in American history. By the time the last Corsair rolled out, 12,586 units had been built. From 1940 through the 1,950 ESPs, it spanned eras. From piston dogfights to jet dawn, proving adaptable, reliable, and lethal, long after rivals vanished. The fighter that once dueled Zeros over Bougainville returned to war in Korea. Corsairs screamed low over frozen mountains, dropping bombs, rockets, and napalm on entrenched forces. One story sealed its legend. On December 4, 1950, during the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, Navy pilot Jesse Brown, America's first black naval aviator, crash-landed his Corsair in the snow and ice. His wingman, Lt. Thomas Hudner, refused to leave him. In a decision that defied doctrine, Hudner deliberately crash-landed his own Corsair beside Brown's wreck. He hacked at the canopy with bare hands in sub-zero wind until night forced him away. Brown did not survive, but Hudner's act earned the Medal of Honor. Later, Hudner explained simply, "I will never leave my wingman." The Corsair was no longer just a machine of war. It had become a stage for loyalty, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The 1950 Chosin Action Report logged the cold numbers: 14 dF temperature, 4,000 F elevation, and Brown trapped as daylight failed. The entry was clinical. The memory was searing. Together, Brown and Hudner embodied the Corsair's second life, still testing the men who flew it long after the Pacific had been won. Final total built, 12,586. U.S. service life, 1940193. Foreign service. Until 1969 in 13 air forces. Top speed, 446 mph, rivaling early jets at low altitude. Hudner's rescue attempt, DK-4, 1950. 14 deg, E-4000 FT elevation. For a fighter once doubted by its own Navy, its longevity was astonishing. Generals later said what Marines already knew. General Lemuel Shepard declared, "The Corsair symbolized Marine air power. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa to Korea, its bent silhouette and whistling note became shorthand for Marines in the sky. That whistle became legend. Air rushing through wing root intakes produced a distinct scream in dives. To Marines, it was the sound of salvation. To enemies, it carried a darker name. Allied newspapers spread the term whistling death. Whether Japanese pilots widely used it is doubtful. Post-war evidence suggests it was mostly propaganda amplified into myth. Yet the myth fused with memory. Today, the nickname is inseparable from the Corsair's identity, a reminder that war stories often echo louder than statistics. By war's end, the Corsair's great rival, the Zero, had vanished. Its factories bombed, its survivors scrapped or left to rot on jungle airstrips. The Corsair endured. It flew in French hands over Indochina, in Latin America during border wars, and in American hands over Korea. The contrast was stark. One fighter became a relic of defeat, the other a symbol of endurance. The irony was inescapable. The fighter once banned from carriers, cursed as the ensign eliminator, outlasted nearly every piston rival. It flew longer, farther, harder than anyone in 1940 dared imagine. From mockery to reverence, the Corsair's story came full circle. Today, in hangars and at airshows, its bent wings still whistle through the sky. Veterans pause when they hear it. Some smile, others stand silent. Younger generations tilt their heads upward, watching a machine older than their grandparents, yet still alive in flight. The Corsair is no longer feared, it is remembered. A fighter once doubted, then feared, then legendary, the whistling death endures, a bent-winged bird that refused to die.